My name is Megan and I built this lovely SUV camper, and my boyfriend and I just did a very in-depth walkthrough of how we designed and built the solar and electrical system so it could be totally off-grid. It's very dense, so take out your notepads, but also I'll use this as an opportunity to plug my SUV camper guide that actually has this all written out along with all the dimensions, photos, and everything else there is to know about the camper. So if you're interested, check that out. Ryan is an electrician, so he's professional at that, but please do your due diligence before taking any action of your own, because I don't want to be liable for your mistakes. Anyways, let's get into it.
Hello everybody. I'm going to kind of show you a basic this is a good example for sort of your standard RV setup. You kind of need three main parts to your system: a battery source, an inverter so that you can run your electronics and all that kind of stuff. Then you need some kind of generator, something to charge your battery and keep it topped up. And in this case, we have two different sources, which we'll show you. We just put everything behind the passenger seat. I would have liked a little bit more space than I got to do it, but this is what Megan gave me, so I had to figure out a way to make it work. And I think that's kind of the fact of the matter when you're doing these van builds. You have a lot less space to work with. So I've got the battery in here, and I anchored it down with some kind of angle iron, and I cut out pieces all around the battery, and I actually bolted it right down to the frame of the vehicle. And that way I could ratchet strap this down and keep it from flying around, because it's a heavy battery. You want to keep this secure. This is an AGM battery. I would really recommend the AGMs. You can go lead acid, but they're a lot bigger typically, and the maintenance is higher. You have to top them up, add distilled water to it. The AGM is totally sealed, so it's not off-gassing and that kind of stuff. It worked really well for Megan. We'll move on to the inverter now, and then we'll go back and talk a little bit about what we're doing for topping up this battery. But this is the storage for the whole thing. And we picked up a 1,000-watt inverter. I mounted it kind of on its side because it's really all the space we had to be able to get this in here. So I just mounted a couple of 2x4s. This inverter basically comes off of the battery, and what it does is it converts your electricity from DC, which is what the battery stores, to AC, which is what we use in residential kind of everyday use. I don't know how much detail you wanted for this video, but
This is very valuable.
Okay, good. All right, great. I'm just winging it here.
Okay, well.
Oh, I'm gonna continue on.
Keep going? Okay.
These thick gauge cables, we used 1/0. It's efficient that way. Sometimes if you were to use thinner cables and you were to be running a lot of electricity through this inverter, they get really hot. So the thicker the better. And when you're looking for your cable, it'll have a 1-0. That's how you know it's 1/0. I tried to opt for the shortest ones I could find, but you can definitely crimp your own ends on. I went out and found a supplier that just had pre-crimped ends on. Just with everything rattling around and stuff, when you're on the road, you want to make sure you have good crimped ends. It runs into a little
inverter fuse block.
Yeah, a little fuse block. This fuse can be changed out. If anything goes haywire, that's going to burn up before you start a fire, before your cables burn up. So that's just a safety mechanism that you want on at least one side, either your positive or your negative. It could be on either side. So that fuse block is in place for that. The inverter, basically all we did was, it's got an AC plug on one side, your kind of standard receptacle. See if Megan can get around here to show you guys. Here, I'll just pick up the camera myself. It's a GFI plug, which you often see in kitchens. Little extra safety if you spill some water or something, that's gonna trip. We ran the power actually just down here, so that gives Megan more plugs. This extension cable here, we ran into the side under the car paneling, and it goes to a plug right over here. Basically, we just went into the hardware store and looked at different plugs until we could find one that was like a mobile plug, And we thought, oh, this will work. And we just cut out a space around it and mounted it in. It's got a 2x4 in behind it to secure it. And then it's just kind of poking through the siding. What we should maybe do is go out and look at our generation sources. And then we'll come back and show how it ties back in to charge the battery. We put on a solar panel to charge our battery. I believe it's 100 watts. The reason why we got this size is because it fit perfectly to the dimensions of the space by the Thule. I would say get as big of a solar panel as you possibly can fit. We just bolted it. There's little kind of bolt holes in the back of this. I actually did have to drill through the frame a little bit to do this. You got to protect that back plate on your panel. So I just put a piece of wood in behind, and I was very careful when I drilled through the frame. Drilled accordingly on the solar panel, and then I slipped in a couple of bolts. Megan and I just took this whole thing off. We actually unbolted this Thule frame and stuck it upside down on the ground, mounted the solar panel off so that we could really tighten it down. And then we flipped the whole thing back over and screwed it on. We spent a lot of time head scratching and staring at the thing, and then we thought, let's just take the darn frame off and we'll just bolt it down that way. If we go around to the other side here, the wires run from the other side underneath the solar panel. There's a positive and negative that come out 2 wires. We ran them into a couple of extension cables, and you got to get some PV cables, so look specifically for PV, photovoltaic cable. I got a red and a black just so that it was easier to identify which is positive and which is negative. We picked up this
Entry gland.
an entry gland. So it comes with 2 liquid tight connectors. I took a hole saw and literally just drilled right through the top of the vehicle. I ended up sneaking it through. If you take off this and sort of look in there, in behind the actual frame, fed them all the way down to the floor right by the battery. As much of that pull through the frame as I could get, I stuck it through a little bit of flexible conduit. It's just to protect that PV cable. And the solar comes in to charge the battery. PV electricity does come in DC, which is the same type of electricity as the battery, but it needs to be sort of regulated. So you need to get some kind of charge controller. I really like these SunSavers. They're a super basic charge controller, but they're really easy to install. This plate comes off and there's screw terminals in there, and you just strip the wire and stick it up into the terminal and just tighten it down. It's all labeled with a little sun, positive, negative, battery. The thing is idiot proof. Can I say that on this? Okay, so
zoomed in.
there is a load side to this charge controller, and it allows you to connect any 12-volt load. It can either be lights or your 12-volt fridge if you have one. We just ran out a positive and negative from there with a little inline fuse, because the thinking is you want to attach a fuse close to the source, either right off of the battery or, you know, in this case, right off of the charge controller. I would caution you to make sure you do hook it up on the 12-volt side where it's labeled load. You don't want to link that up on the solar side, or it's going to be way more than 12 volt. This is essentially, this load is coming off your battery. I decided to use it and utilize it because it's just less things coming off of your terminals on your battery so that you're not loading these up. The thing about DC is that if that positive and negative ever touch, it's not dangerous to electrocute yourself. I mean, I can grab these 2 terminals on the battery and I'm fine, but it is a fire hazard, you know, so it's just a bit different in terms of what the risks are. Oh, there goes your camera. One obvious thing and unique thing about having a van is you've got a mobile generator. You have something that every single time it goes down the road, that's a generator. There's moving parts there that we can actually use the electricity off of. So we used what's called an isolator. Every vehicle has an alternator built into it. That alternator charges your car battery. Essentially, our goal was to split off of that alternator and use some of that extra current to charge up our battery. That way, every time Megan fired up the vehicle and she was traveling down the highway, it was charging up her battery. We mounted the isolator over here. I went to the automotive store and I just basically asked the guy like what gauge he would recommend for coming off of that alternator, and they supplied me with some pretty thick gauge cable. I think, again, the thicker the better. It becomes a cost thing though. If you want to get 1/0, it's going to be very expensive and bulky to install. And this was an isolator that we got through Victron Energy, and it's a great brand. I really think it works great. It's an ArgoFET battery isolator, this one's really efficient. We have a long run going all the way from this alternator to the middle of the unit. You get line losses when that happens, so the more efficient you can have your isolator, the better. It comes with a little diagram. You follow that diagram and hook it up accordingly. There's 2 lines. One goes to the battery inside the car, one comes back to the battery in the vehicle. So that just isolates it so that one line is charging the battery in the vehicle as you're driving, simultaneously charging your RV battery, your internal one, but it's not tying the 2 batteries together. Initially, this piece came off of this alternator. So I cut that and spliced it to a new line, which goes to the isolator. And that's the vehicle side. And then we take this line and bring it back to the isolator. If I peel this back, we actually crimped on an end. Can you see that? This cable goes all the way around. We kind of dressed it up around the engine. And we can kind of show you this diagram over here. This input is for the alternator, and then output 1 goes back to the batteries, which charges the batteries, and output 2 charges that battery over there.
Question. You drilled through the vehicle to get it inside, yeah? That's what that little black thing is?
Yeah, that's right. So I actually brought this output 1 into this little nipple here. It's a kind of a liquid tight connector, and I just used a hole saw to get that into the cab. And it's kind of tricky, like you got to use your measuring tape and find a spot. I drilled from the inside into the engine bay, which is less than ideal because you don't want to puncture something. So I had to be really confident where I was drilling. So I measured like 1,000,000 different times from different points to make sure I was finding a place where I could drill through. And then I was really careful about making that penetration once I started to get the metal scored. You just be really careful, don't push hard, and you can get through and then work your nipple into that opening. Comes out just underneath the dash. It's up in here, so actually this came off. I did not crack that, by the way.
Oh, I wondered. I saw that too.
That was not me. Basically just start pulling all that out and find a little spot to drill. The ground basically just goes straight from the isolator to the frame of the vehicle. Ran a self-tapping screw straight into the frame of the vehicle. There's an Energizer line, and it basically just comes off your fuse block. I just took my meter here, set it on the DC settings, stick my meter into there, and then we just got Megan to turn the key. As she was turning the key, we figured out which one was live when she turned the key, and then we used that one. You can get these little add-on fuses. It gets inserted to where the fuse was, and then 2 fuses can go in on the side. That way when that key turns, then it energizes that unit, adds energization to the alternator, and then everything can start working. And you just need a real thin cable for that. It can be, 12 gauge or something like that. When you're looking at it in here, it gets real like confusing. But if you just follow the outputs and go, okay, input, where's the input coming from? It's coming from the alternator. And then output, where do we want our outputs going? Output 1 goes to that battery. Output 2 goes to that battery, right? So that's basically all it is. And then the third thing is that it needs this little Energizer cable just to bring back to your fuse block to sort of energize that alternator.